starting Daf Chav Dalet Amud Aleph. The second to last line.
Well, she couldn't.
Do we lose a rabbi?
It seems he perhaps has muted himself.
Can you guys see the rabbi?
Nope.
I can't see him or hear him.
Right. Well, Moshe, I've got him on WhatsApp. I guess I could send him a tell him.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is log off and then log back in and see if that makes a difference.
Okay, I'm going to do the same, Moshe. This sounds like a good plan.
Let's see what happens.
Okay.
Was everyone able to hear me before? Sorry, I thought everyone could hear me. I don't know what happened there. So we're holding the last words. If somebody receives an aliyah, they must have at least 3 psukim in their aliyah, corresponding to Kollel, Levi, and Yisrael. Our Gemara will give a different reason why we need at least 3 psukim per aliyah. So back in the day, you would have what's called a Targum, a translator. Almost every chumash have next to the chumash on the side over here, you have the Targum. You have a translation in Aramaic. As we learned in the beginning of this Mesechta, in the beginning of Mesechta Megillah on Daf Zkainim, if I recall, or Daf Hey, the Targum, the translation of the Torah, was given over to Moshe, was taught to Moses by Mount Sinai. With the Torah was given in a translation into 70 languages. However, it was forgotten. It was reinstated, the translation, through Ruach HaKodesh, through prophecy, when the Jews went into Babel, the Jews went into exile in Babylonia. And many Jews were not familiar with Hebrew. They've been so long in Galus, in exile, they forgot Hebrew. Sounds like something that happens very common today. People don't know the holy tongue. And it was reinstated by the different Nevi'im, the different prophets then. The Jews went back to Eretz Yisrael, and it was sort of forgotten in the proper context, a proper way again. And it was reinstated by Unclus Agar. Unclus was a Roman nephew of the Emperor Hadrian, Roman nobility. Famous story how he became Jewish, he converted, and his uncle tried to forcibly bring him back to Rome to judge him, to execute him. And every squad of soldiers that was sent, Unclus managed to convert them, including the very last one. If you don't know the story, read your local Mendy and the Golam. You can ask some of the authors who are on this group to help you to read it. That's the first time I got to know the story. So
You quote the source, you bring redemption closer.
You bring the source and what?
You quote the source and you bring the redemption closer.
That's right. So we have the actual source here. The source. We're no, we are instead of soldiers, we are soul dyers. Right. That's the last word of the story. Kuntres, he reinstates the Targum translation, and since many people in the shuls did not know Targum, did not know Hebrew, the only language they understood was Aramaic. So in every single shul, you had what's called a meturgaman, a translator. You would read a pasuk, a verse from the Torah. So let's say this pasuk, then you would have the translator, and they would translate Aramaic. There's two different translations that we have currently in Aramaic. One is the Targum Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, who is probably closer to what a meturgaman would actually be. A meturgaman, he would translate, but add in a few extra words of explanation. You can understand the context a little more. Rashi is more, Kuntres is more literal to the word, but he also, at many times, many instances, adds on a little bit, a word or two of context, or changes the order in order to make it understood better. Of course, Eretz Shabbos, we're supposed to say Shnayim Mikra Vecha Targum, the Torah twice, and the Targum Kuntres one time. One time, my father's birthday, when he was a bacher, the yeshiva student was on a Friday, and he was in Yichidus by the Rebbe. At that time, every single whoever had a birthday was able to go into Yichidus by the Rebbe around every year in the near the time of the birthday. And the Rebbe told him that since your birthday is on Friday, you should make sure to finish Mavir Sedra, to do the Parsha twice, Chumash, and once Kuntres, make sure to finish before Shabbos, as it's your birthday. And he always made sure to finish it always before Shabbos. I know the Bacher who once was by Fabrengen when he repeated that, and he said since then he's been doing it for many years. So this is Kuntres, Targum Kuntres. Here's another random pasuk. And Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, in English, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying. In Aramaic is Umaayon Hashem and Moshe Lemimar. Here I picked up a very old incalculable from the earliest generation of Chumashim that were ever printed. Means anything from before, I think, the 1500s is incalculable. Makes sense? So it's older Ramban, and you see you have the Chumash over here. This is Parshas Vayechi. And next to it you have Kuntres. You had Rashi, and you have the Ramban, and etc. So this is, you see from the very first Chumashim, Kuntres Targum was already part of the Chumash. The only community that I'm aware of that still does this today is that after every pasuk, every verse, you have a meturgaman, a translator, repeating it. Is some Taimani, some Yemenite communities, which have many very ancient customs, because they were, you could say, so far from everyone, from the regular Jewish communities of the rest of the world, that they still keep many old customs, including a meturgaman, except they call it a turjuman. And it's actually a very common last name in the Yemenite community, is turjuman. Turjuman, which comes from the word turgaman, which means translator, was a very honorable thing to be. It was like a wise person, someone who could translate the Torah after every pasuk, after every verse. So in the Torah, when you're reading the Chumash, the weekly Torah portion, you can only do one pasuk at a time, one verse at a time. You cannot do several verses at a time. Because if somebody would do several verses at a time, let's say you do verses 1, 2, 3 at once, and then translate, so then people can make a mistake. Or the translator can make a mistake. You have so much information to translate at once, you're not going to remember every detail. And therefore, you might make a mistake. And the Torah is very important to be exact. Because in the Torah, you learn a lot of mitzvahs. There's 613 mitzvahs mentioned in the Torah. If he makes a mistake in some of the words, in some of the translations, or he skips details, people could learn from there how make different understandings of mitzvahs, and can make big mistakes. 24a1. So therefore, because a translator might make a mistake, and because the one listening might make a mistake, and in addition, Torah is very high level of holiness, extremely high level of holiness. It comes literally from Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem, and Har Sinai. So therefore, you only do one pasuk, one verse at a time. The Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon, he writes the reason why today we don't have a translator after every pasuk, every verse, because seemingly, throughout our diaspora, Jews have been all over the world. We've learned all types of languages, and throughout history, it was very, very common that even a Jew who davens Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv, goes to shul, prays, says Tehillim, even they would not know the Holy Tongue and understand Hebrew. And even today, where it's more common that people are educated if they're going to shul, but still, there's the vast majority of the Jewish people who do not know the Holy Tongue. So why don't we have a translator today, translating it to whatever language you are? So here in America, you would translate it in English. You go to Brazil in Portuguese, and everywhere else, after every pasuk, every verse, translate it. Why not? So the Tur in Shulchan Aruch, and he's the father of the Rosh, the son of the Rosh, beginning of the codified halacha, and he writes that since Targum was written with Ruach HaKodesh, with prophecy, and we learned in the beginning of this Mesechta, when the Targum was written, right, after it was written on Daniel, the whole land of Israel shook. If you remember that, 500, it said 25,000 square miles of land shook. If you remember, how does that fit into the borders of Israel? Earlier in this Mesechta. So Targum was written with Lashon Kodesh, with Ruach HaKodesh, with prophecy. And therefore, the only Targum that we know is accurate with prophecy written is the Aramaic, the Unclus, or the Targum Yenis and Menuzil. Those are the ones that we know were written with Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirit. Therefore, in the middle of a Kriyas Torah, middle of Torah reading, we can't just interrupt. You're not supposed to talk. But to translate with a translation that's Ruach HaKodesh with prophecy, which is Aramaic, you could interrupt. However, nowadays, the vast majority of the Jewish people do not understand Aramaic. And if you're trying to translate to them, if they know Aramaic, chances are, if somebody knows Aramaic today, they probably know Hebrew as well. So therefore, we don't translate, and thank you to them, because our shul service will be a lot longer if we had to translate every single pasuk, every verse. Instead, we do it by ourselves. We say Shnai Mikra by ourselves. So this is when it comes to reading the Torah. Let's look over here. Torah is only 5 of the 24 books of the Tanakh. There are another 19 books, Sfarim, holy books, which are in Nevi'im, the prophets, and in Kesuvim, in the writings.
Ezra and Nehemiah are actually one book.
Okay.
Yep.
Ezra and Nehemiah are considered to be one book. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Fine. And you have Treyaser. But at any rate, Nevi'im are the prophets. Kesuvim are, again, there is a lot of, we went through some of this, why there's a lot of discussion why some things are included in the Tanakh, some things are not. There's a fancy English term, don't remember right now, I checked it up earlier, triumvirate or something, which basically means Tanakh. Esther, she asked the Nevi'im, she asked the Sanhedrin to put Esther, Megillah Esther, as part of Tanakh. And like we had before, I think 18 different introductions or 21 different introductions when they learn Megillah Esther, all to explain how it's all holy and it's all belonging in Tanakh. Daniel, which is in Kesuvim over here, even though he was a prophet, it's mainly written in Aramaic, Daniel, only a little bit is in Hebrew. But you see, even in the times of Daniel, you already had a Tanakh. We're quoting here from Daniel. This is chapter 9, verse 2. We did verse 1. We're talking about earlier in the Mesechta, talking about the history of the Persian emperors. And he says, in the first year of Darius, son of Achashverosh, I contemplated the calculations. Remember, we quoted this verse before. It's like, the 70 years should have been up. Why is the Beis HaMikdash not being built? And eventually, the Beis HaMikdash started being built the next year. It was just 1 year off because of whatever calculations. 2 kings were king for half a year at a time. But he says, I was looking in the Sfarim, in the books. Which Sfarim was he looking in? So he says, there were obviously books of Tanakh. Besides the Torah, there was Nevi'im and there's Ksuvim. Because you had Yirmiyahu's prophecy, Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years. You had several other places which are mentioned. But it wasn't yet finalized. You could say what was exactly part of Tanakh. There was there's a book called Ben Sira, which is quoted very, very often. Not very often. It's quoted often in Gemara, but it's not part of Tanakh. He's a contemporary, a prophet. They say it was a son of Yirmiyahu, son of Jeremiah, but whatever reasons, he wouldn't be allowed to. He didn't trace his lineage to his father, but rather either to his mother or to his mother was named Sira, but he wasn't considered to be Yirmiyahu's son per se. It's not part of Tanakh. What chooses? We learned earlier about Shirim and Mishlei. One of them mentions Hashem's name once. One of them does not mention Hashem's name at all. And they're still part of. One of them, Shirim only mentions Hashem's name once. Mishlei mentions many times. And it's still part of Tanakh. It's from Shlomi HaMelech. And there was an explanation for every single one of them why it's part of Tanakh, why it's not. However, these are all part of Nach, Nevi'im and Ksuvim, which we don't have any mitzvahs written in Nevi'im and Ksuvim. All the 7 mitzvahs that we have in the Rabbanim from these sages were enacted during the times of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, or later, but they're not written in the Nach. So, therefore, you don't have to have as exact as a translation. The translation that we have is not Unklis, it's other translations that we have on Nach. And the level of sanctity of Nevi'im and Ksuvim is not as holy as a Torah. So therefore, somebody reads a Torah should not do less than 3 psukim. When he has a translator translating, he should only do 1 verse at a time. However, Uvanavi, with regard to the prophets, Hayu Shlashtan Shloisha. When it comes to Nevi'im, so let's say in the Haftorah, when we read prophets, you could translate 3 verses at a time. So the Haftarah would also have a translator. So let's say Uri, let's say these 3 verses, or not these 3, that's a bad example, but let's go later on, because Gemara is going to discuss this example. But let's say verses 10, 11, 12, which is a 3 psukim from Yeshaya, from Isaiah. And when the person reading the Haftorah read 3 verses together, and the translator could translate 3 verses together. If he misses something, no one's going to make a mistake with a mitzvah. The level of sanctity is not as high as a Torah, and therefore you could do 3 psukim, 3 verses at a time. There's an exception if there were 3 verses constituting 3 different paragraphs, and that's where we have Daniel over here. We'll have an example in the Gemara. If you have 3 verses in a row, each verse is a different topic or a different paragraph, and you don't have that too common in Nach, where every pasuk, every verse is a new paragraph. You do have it over here in Yeshaya, in Isaiah, where you see the samach over there. It says kichai. There's a samach stuma. It's a new paragraph, and it says kichai. If it says Hashem, you were sold for nothing, shall be redeemed without money. And then is another samach. It's its own paragraph. So then when you read it, and then you translate it one pasuk at a time. Next is Kichoy Amar Hashem. So says Hashem. My nation went down to Egypt to live, and the Assyrians oppressed them without cause. So in these cases, what it means either is when it says Kichoy Amar Hashem, thus says Hashem, you're mentioning Hashem's name, and it's a holy thing, or when it's a separate paragraph, then Kurin Echad Echad. Then the reader who reads after reads one verse, and the translator translates every pasuk, every verse for itself, because every pasuk, every verse is something unique. And the other Mefarshim, Chaim, understands it to mean that even if you have 3 psukim, even if it's not a different paragraph, if it's different topics, so then you do then you do one pasuk, one verse at a time. Because if you do 2 verses at a time, it's going to be very confusing. Medalgim and Navi, ve'em medalgim and Torah. Skipping around the Navi. Let me get my prop. Hold on. It's right over here. Yeah. Here, can't see so well. I have my Sefer Torah. Let me remove the background for a minute. I might be able to see it better without a background. Here's my little handy Sefer Torah that I have. When I read an aliyah, I have to read straight. I can't skip around within one aliyah. There are a few times, for example, a fast day, Yom Kippur in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, where they would move around. They would change. When you do skip around, you don't read consecutively, but that's not within one aliyah. Different aliyahs, you could skip between aliyahs, you would skip around. When you're reading the Torah, you can't skip around. However, Ben Navi, in prophets, you do skip around, and we have it all the time. Many haftarah. So you have a haftarah, and then you skip a few psukim, and then you can say further, or you bring in a pasuk, a verse from another book of Tanakh entirely. You have it very often by the haftarah. You skip around. Nowadays, we have fancy haftarah books, and everything's written straight. Then they didn't have that. And they would have to go through a scroll. But since you have a lot of time, you have 3 psukim being read at a time, translators translating 3 psukim at a time. The reader has time to move to the next parsha. You could quickly either open a new scroll, or if it's close enough to go to a new area, a new parsha. But in the Torah, where it's one pasuk, you do not have enough time to go to a new parsha. Plus, you have to concentrate much more when it comes to the Torah. So medalgim and Navi medalgim and Torah. When reading the Navi, the prophets, you could skip from place to place. When you're reading the Torah, you cannot skip from place to place. Yes. How much are you allowed to skip around and not do consecutively? As far as you can. So let's say I'm reading. Let's say it's a book of Haftarahs and I'm reading. So I read 3 psukim. And let's say now I got to go to the next chapter of Zechariah. So while the translator is translating, here paper makes noise. Paper makes a lot of noise. Parchment does not make as much noise as paper. When you're moving it, you can move it, especially back then. They didn't really have Chaim. They didn't have poles. You're able to move it quietly without disturbing the whole entire shul. And then, during that time, while he's speaking, you can move on to the next place, to the next area, to the next part. So therefore, when it comes to Torah, you don't skip around. And also in Torah, when you're skipping around from place to place, people aren't going to be able to pay attention, or people might make a mistake. But when it comes to Navi, you could skip around as long the amount of time that it takes, that you could move to the next portion before the translator finishes translating. So, I mean, my first time ever in Pittsburgh was this past Simchas Torah. And for me, it was new, the whole concept of on Simchas Torah, you have 3 Sefer Torah. For Chassan Torah, Chassan Bereshis, and then again for Bamidbar. I've always been in 770 in Crown Heights. The main minyan is packed beyond. And every other minyan only has 1 Sefer Torah. And during the time, there's a reshus, you call up a person for Chassan Bereshis for the first Aliyah. During that time, you have to work, everyone has to work fast and roll the Torah from the end all the way to the beginning. That's the way I always knew it. And I came to Pittsburgh, it was almost like, what? There's actually 3 Sefer Torah on Simchas Torah? So there's an idea that you're not supposed to do tircha detzibura, and it's a theme that we've seen before. To hold people needlessly, to waste their time. And people you have to respect the congregation, respect everybody, and therefore you don't read from 2 different places because you're going to have to move from place to place. However, you couldn't move in the amount of time that it takes to move to translate those 3 psukim, those 3 verses. Tosfos over here on the page is actually very interesting. If we can bring up the Tosfos. Let me see if I can bring it up here. Tosfos in the word v'im. V'im. Which he says that although in the times of Tosfos, so Tosfos is about 800 years ago. Right? Rashi about 900 years ago, Tosfos is about 800 years ago. So although in their times, they no longer were translating into Targum simultaneously, meaning word, verse by verse, but they would do it on Pesach. Why on Pesach? In order to publicize the miracle of the day. And what sounds like there's even places which still have that custom that on Pesach, they translate the Haftarah. And the Sfas Emes says, here, the reason why they did it is because, if you try thinking about it, at that time, you had a lot of, the time of Tosfos, and Tosfos is the same time as a Rambam. One of the Rambam's well-known battles they had to fight was against the Karaites, Karayim. And the Karayim, they were sort of like the Tzedukkim, they would take the Torah at face value. Right? They would say, we don't believe in Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral Torah, only the written Torah. And they would try saying that Pesach should always be on Sunday, because the Torah says, Macharas HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos. So let's, I'm going to go like this. Torah, Vayikra. Where is it? 23. 11. Verse 11. Let's show Rashi. Torah says, is Parshas Emor, here are the mitzvah, here are the Yom Tov and the holidays that we do. And Hashem tells him about the mitzvah of the Omer. What's the Omer? Omer is that when you have to bring barley to the Beis HaMikdash, you have to cut it, you have to harvest it on the day after Pesach. Pesach is 1 day. And the next day, the first day of Chol HaMoed, you have to, that night, you cut the Omer and you bring a korban Omer, a korban mincha, a flour offering in the Beis HaMikdash on that day. And the Torah says, and you should wave the Omer, wave the offering in the Beis HaMikdash in front of Hashem. The day after Shabbos, Rashi says, on the day after the first holiday of Pesach. Because if you say Shabbos, you do not know which Shabbos. Because we're talking about over here the Yom Tov of Pesach. So it means on the first day of Chol HaMoed, right? Which would be Tes Ayin Nisan, the 16th of Nisan. The Tzedukim, they would say that the Korban Omer, the meal offering, has to be brought only on a Sunday, and they would hire false witnesses. Back then, Rosh Chodesh would go based according to when witnesses, people saw the new moon. They would try manipulating the calendar that Pesach should always come out to be on Shabbos, and the Korban Omer should be brought on Sunday. That way, the whole Jewish nation would follow their lead. Would always be following what the Tzedukim would say. In the Haftorah, on the first day of Pesach, we say like this. Back to the Tiferes. Yeshua Gimel. Let's go to Yeshua. Nevi'im, chapter 3. This is the Jewish nation. They traveled from Shittim. Remember that place? And they came in, and they're all in Shittim, and they came into Eretz Yisrael. It was on the 11th of Nisan, the 12th of Nisan. They came into Eretz Yisrael. Hashem made tremendous miracles, and they crossed over the Yarden. And it says over here, Vayochlu Mavura Eretz Mimacharas HaPesach. And they ate from the land. Let's pull it up. Sorry, wrong chapter. Chapter 5. It says, verse 11. It says, entire Jewish nation, they gave themselves a bris milah. They brought the Korban Pesach. They camped in Gilgal, and they made Pesach on the 14th of the month on the plains of Yeruchai. And they ate from the grain of the land, Mimachras HaPesach, a day after Pesach. So from here we see clearly from the Haftarah on Pesach that when the Jewish people made a Korban Pesach in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land, and on the day after Pesach, on the 16th of Nisan, they ate the new grain after bringing the Korban Omer. So in the Torah, it just says that Merchas Shabbos, the day after Shabbos. In the Haftarah, it says that they ate the new grain, Mimakaras HaPesach, a day after Pesach. And the Targum translation, Aramaic translation, is that everyone should understand it. You want to publicize a fact that when it says a day after Shabbos in the Torah doesn't mean the day after Shabbos, rather it means the day after Pesach. So that's why this Haftarah particularly, they would translate in Aramaic even in the times of the Tiferes.
Question is, physically, if everyone was in Yerushalayim offering the Korban Pesach, when did they have time to go back to wherever they came from and cut the Omer, then get back to Yerushalayim?
The Omer was always one Omer for the one field next to the Beis HaMikdash, right outside Yerushalayim. It wasn't that every person brought their own Korban Omer, right? It was one field that the Beis HaMikdash would lease. They would send inspectors around, see what's the best field, and they would bring the Korban Omer just from one field.
Okay.
So the day after Pesach, or is it the day after the first of Pesach?
The day Pesach is only one day from the Torah. We have 2 days and plus the seventh day, which is Shiur Pesach. But what it calls the Pesach is the day you bring the Korban Pesach, which is you eat the Korban Pesach on the first night. They would cut the Omer by night, right? The night Matzah Yom Tov is 16th, and they would bring it in the Beis HaMikdash only the next day, the first day of Chol Hamoed. Fine. It says the Gemara, "Hani shloisha psukim keneged mi." We said that an aliyah When you call someone to the Torah, it has to be at least 3 verses. Why 3 verses? Amar Rav Asi, says Rav Asi, Keneged Torah Neviim Uksuvim, corresponding to the 3 parts of Tanakh, the Torah, the Neviim, and the Ksuvim, 3 parts of Tanakh. That's why we have at least 3 psukim, 3 verses. If you remember before, the Gemara before said that the reason why we have 3 verses was corresponding to Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, 3 different types of Jews. Here the Gemara gives a different reason. And it corresponds to Torah, Neviim, and Ksubim. But it comes to teach you that everybody, that first of all, they're all included in the Torah. And you can't say that just because one is not directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses, it's less holy. They all come directly from the Torah. In addition to that, if you remember, everyone would get an aliyah, they would read their own aliyah. So why should Yisrael, the third aliyah, why should he read 2 psukim to correspond to Kohen and Levi? So therefore we said it corresponds to Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. And although I'm reading the Torah, I shouldn't just be satisfied with learning Torah. I should learn all 3 parts, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Tosfos Harash over here answers that psukim are different than aliyah. So though it's at least 3 of each, but you should know every Jew and every part of Torah is included in Torah. Now up to the next part, Targum, but we'll do just the next 2 dots. It's like 3 different sugyas. It says Targum and Yoser in Pasuk Achad. When the Torah is being translated, you have the one pasuk being read, and then right away. Sorry, you have one verse being read, and then right away you have the translation in Aramaic. But when you're translating the prophets, the Haftarah, you could do 3 psukim at a time. However, if 3 verses constitute 3 separate paragraphs, you read them one by one. And the Gemara gives an example. Going, for example, Hashem chinam nimkartem, Hashem alekim Mitzrayim yaradim ivrishanav at malifayin umashem. And it was, here it is, verses 3, 4, and 5 are all 3 different topics. So says Hashem, you are sold for nothing. So says Hashem, my people went to Egypt. Now says Hashem, what should I do if my people have been taken away for nothing? But they have forgotten me, and Hashem says, I will remember them, I will make them remember me. So these 3 psukim, these 3 verses, are 3 different topics. Rashi over here, I'm not going to bring it up on the screen, but Rashi explains that in verse 3, Chinan Kartim, you were sold for nothing. That is going on the Yetzer Hara, because the Yetzer Hara wants you to do things for Chinam. If you do a mitzvah, Chinam means free. If you do a mitzvah, you get a schar. It's not for free, but he wants you to do things that are averis, which have nothing. Hashem will not give anything. Worthless things. You'll not be redeemed with money. Hashem says, don't think you could bribe your way out of galus, out of exile. You can't bribe Hashem. Tzedakah, you could say, sort of is a bribe to Hashem, but you can't bribe your way out of galus. Rather, you need to do teshuvah. The next verse, Daled, which is a new paragraph, Rashi explains, Mitzrayim Yarad Ami, my nation went down into Egypt. When the Egyptians enslaved the Jews, it wasn't the Egyptians, you could say, were not completely guilty. They had a very minimal type of claim saying the Jews came down to Egypt, and when there was a hunger and we supported them, we gave them food to eat. So in the beginning, you could say Mitzrayim, the Egyptians had maybe a claim, but Ashur, the Assyrians, we never went to their land, and they attacked us in our land. So they for no cause attacked us, and they went against the Jews for no reason. That's the second verse. So it's the second topic. And third topic is Hashem. What am I doing here? Says Hashem. Why should I keep my children in exile? Says Hashem, for so long. Because in the beginning, when they were taken, it was for no reason. When they were taken for nothing. And what's worse is that all the nations who conquer the Jewish people are boasting, oh, look who we do. We conquer the Jewish nation. And it's a big chil Hashem. Hashem's name is desecrated always and constantly blasphemed. These nations conquered the Jewish people. They're not thinking Hashem. They're blaspheming Hashem. And therefore, since all these psukim, all these verses are completely different, and completely different topics. So therefore, the translation is each one individually, each one separately. We'll pause the Gemara over here. Halacha Lamaisa is that we don't skip when we read the Torah. The only exceptions are on a fast day. We're between aliyahs. The first aliyah is in one chapter, one column in the Torah. And the next aliyah is in the next column, and you literally don't even have to turn the 2 columns there. You almost don't have to turn the Sefer Torah. It doesn't take up any time from the congregation. Plus, it's in the same topic about how Hashem forgiving the Jewish people after sinning with the golden calf. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would read in the Beis HaMikdash. He would move around a little bit. However, he would read some parts by heart because it was much further away and there wasn't enough time to roll the Torah all the way to there. In the Navi, you're allowed to skip around, especially the way we do Navi nowadays. Is the vast majority of people don't read it from an actual scroll, or read it from a chumash or from a book of Haftarahs, which is printed. And we do skip around. There's certain parameters, but we do skip around entirely. All right. Tomorrow, Mr. Hashem, we're going to continue this topic. We'll get into the topic of a blind person. Blind people's rights. But that's going to be Mr. Hashem for tomorrow. And with this,